Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the life and, well, the legacy of one of the most ruthless drug lords in history, Griselda Blanco. So, after this life filled with just unimaginable wealth and just brutal violence, her story doesn't end in some lavish mansion. Nope, it ends right there on a city street.
It was just 2 gunshots to the head. That's it, from an assassin on a motorcycle. You know, her end was just as swift and brutal as the violence she used to build her entire empire. A public execution that really mirrored the countless lives she'd already taken.
And here's the crazy part, a really dark twist of irony. She was killed by the exact same method she was famous for pioneering, the motorcycle assassination. She literally helped create it.
So, that begs the question, right? How did a woman from this incredibly troubled background in Colombia rise up to become the infamous godmother of cocaine? All right, let's get into it and really trace her path from poverty to absolute power.
So let's start at the beginning. Griselda's life in crime started, well, shockingly young. She grew up in Medellin, a city that was just steeped in turmoil. And that environment, it really shaped everything she would become.
And I mean, look at this. At just 11 years old, she allegedly kidnaps and shoots a child. By 19, she's running away from home to escape abuse, and by 20, she's pickpocketing just to survive. This wasn't some slow slide into crime, you know? It was a headfirst dive. Violence became her language, the only tool she had to survive in a city that gave her pretty much no other choices.
Okay, so that's her brutal start. But how do you go from being a street criminal in Medellin to a full-blown coast-to-coast drug lord in the U.S.? Well, let's take a look at how she built that empire.
So here's the playbook. First, she gets into the U.S. illegally in '64, sets up shop in Queens, New York. Then she and her second husband build this booming cocaine business. Things get hot, so in '75, she flees back to Colombia to avoid charges. But she doesn't stay there. In the late '70s, she comes back, this time to Miami, to start a whole new empire. You see, this wasn't just random. It was a calculated plan. She knew when to push, when to expand, and maybe most importantly, when to retreat and regroup. That kind of strategic thinking is what really set her apart.
And the scale of this operation, I mean, just look at this number. $80 million a month. That's what her network was pulling in at its absolute peak. It's just staggering.
And, you know, her return to Miami wasn't quiet. It perfectly coincided with the start of what everyone now calls the Miami drug war. We're talking about an era of just insane public violence, hundreds of murders a year. And she didn't just join this war. She basically lit the fuse. The kind of brazen, out-in-the-open violence she brought was something nobody had ever seen before. It literally turned the streets of Miami into a war zone.
But look, an empire that's this violent, this public, it just can't last forever, right? It was only a matter of time before the feds started closing in. And that day came on February 17th, 1985. DEA agents finally busted down her door and arrested her. The charge? Conspiracy to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. This was it. This was the beginning of the end for her reign. So she gets convicted on the federal drug charges. Guilty. Sentenced to 15 years in prison. And you'd think that's a big deal, and it was, but the state of Florida, they were just waiting in the wings with something even more serious. Because while she's already serving that sentence, Florida hits her with 3 counts of first-degree murder. And their case looked solid. I mean, they're all hinged on the testimony of one of her most trusted hitmen, a guy named Jorge Ayala. He was ready to get on the stand and say she ordered the killings. And then, things got weird. Like, really weird. Just when it seemed like a conviction was a sure thing, the whole case collapses. Why? Because of technicalities related to, get this, a phone sex scandal between Ayala, their star witness, and 2 secretaries from the state attorney's office. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It sounds like something out of a movie, but this bizarre little scandal completely discredited their main witness and derailed the entire murder case.
So, what happens? In the end, she pleads guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder, not first. She gets 20 years, but it runs at the same time as her federal sentence. The key takeaway here is just, wow, she dodged a first-degree murder conviction and maybe even the death penalty because of a completely bizarre, unforeseen technicality. That's just an incredible stroke of luck.
Okay, so her time in prison eventually comes to an end, but her story, oh, it's far from over. After she gets out, it basically transforms into this modern and, yeah, very dark myth.
And a huge part of that myth is her nickname, the Black Widow. It's a name she earned, and it perfectly captures her reputation for, well, deadly betrayal. For Griselda, it seems like even the closest relationships were completely disposable if they got in her way.
And I'm not exaggerating. Let's look at her husbands. First, Carlos Trujillo, executed on her orders over a business dispute. Second, Alberto Bravo. She shot and killed him herself during an argument. And third, Dario Sepulveda, assassinated in Colombia, again on her orders, during a custody battle. This isn't just a coincidence, right? It was practically her business model. It was ruthless, for sure, but it was also a message to everyone in her orbit. Nobody is safe.
So, let's fast forward. In 2004, after almost 20 years in prison, she's released and deported back to Colombia. And for about 8 years, she actually lives a pretty quiet life, totally out of the drug trade. It's almost like she was a ghost of her former self. You might think, okay, maybe she actually outran her past. But in the world Griselda built, old deaths, they never really go away. And on September 3, 2012, that past finally caught up to her.
Her story, which started and ended with so much violence, has now become this permanent fixture in our pop culture. And that transformation, from this notorious criminal into some kind of cultural icon, that's really the last and maybe the most fascinating chapter of her life. It's where the facts start to get blurry and the legend really takes over.
I mean, think about it. You've got documentaries like Cocaine Cowboys, TV movies, that big Netflix series, Griselda, and she gets referenced in music all the time by artists like Drake and Nicki Minaj, Pusha T. Her name has become this cultural shorthand. But it makes you wonder, right? What is it about this incredibly violent person that we're still so captivated?
So who was she really? A feminist anti-hero breaking into a man's world? Just a ruthless, cold-blooded monster? Or was she simply a product of her violent environment, whose legend has now totally overshadowed the brutal reality of what she did? It's a really complex legacy, one that's both fascinating and horrifying. In her story, it really forces us to question the nature of power, of violence, and, well, the sometimes troubling myths we create around people like her.